We can, I think, start now. And let me begin by starting by saying thank you to uh, everybody who has joined this webinar. This is the third collaboration between GRFTD, MFA, and CCRM. Our previous two collaborations were on migration governance and on the role of missions. This is an issue that has picked up in the last 2 months, you know, uh, particularly because of a campaign that was launched. But it was on the 1st of June, some civil society organizations came together to launch this campaign calling for a transitional justice system. Because in all the impact of the COVID, one of the biggest casualties was migrant workers. And a big proponent of those migrant workers were migrant workers who are being repatriated without their dues, without salaries, and with back wages pending. This issue has grown exponentially, and it was a result of this tension of bringing attention to this issue that trade unions and civil society in the region got together to launch this campaign calling for a transitional justice mechanism. Since it was launched on the 1st of June, this campaign has got solidarity from people in the business sector, from some governments, from UN institutions, from trade unions, from national human rights institutions, from academia and civil society. It has resonated with many people in terms of the injustice that we are seeing. But in many ways, it has resonated also because this injustice has only exasperated what has been happening for years and years. And it is time in this process of building back together that we pay attention that if we are going to build back better, coming out of this COVID, we can't build it on flawed foundations of justice. Because in very many cases in the past, these issues were left unaddressed, and many migrant workers have returned to their homes empty handed and in debt. And it is to address this situation that an appeal has been put out to the international community and has resonated with an international community. It is urgent that we address this even as we start thinking of coming out of the COVID and start looking at migration flows and migration governance once again becoming the mainstream of development programs and development strategies among countries of origin and destination. Before I start, I would like to say that I would like to dedicate this session particularly to one of our colleagues who passed away last Narayan Swamy, a trade union leader who has spent many years bringing migrant worker cases to court in India. He has uh, been unrelentless in taking up this issue, and he has also helped in raising this issue through RTIs, in going to countries of destination, documenting cases, coming back home, processing it through the legal system. He has traveled miles and miles in India to reach migrant workers in their homes to document cases and take it up. And he has even spent a lot of his time and resources in taking up this cause. He passed away last week, and we will definitely miss him. He was a very brave soul, very courageous as he took up these cases despite the many oppositions that he had faced. I'd like to dedicate this to him. I'd like to also say that at the start of this call, I want to thank all of the speakers who are on this call, each of them, and I will not do introductions with regard to who they are. All of them are well known within the international community. For those who are encountering them for whatever reason for the first time, please do a Google and you'll find page after page about them. So thank you very much for joining this call. I'd like to thank again the three organizations that have come together and for the many other organizations that have endorsed this call. This is a collective effort coming to this point, and hopefully this is another launching moment for the call itself to take on this big challenge before us, which is not going to be easy. To reform a national justice system is not going to be easy, and to address a crime that has gone unnoticed for so many years is not going to be easy. But we are all in this period of COVID building our future on hope, that there will be hope for a vaccine, that we will come out of these lockdowns, and that we will learn from this process and build back better. If we are going to do this, then we will have to galvanize our strengths, mobilize around this call for the sake of migrant workers. For so many of them, for whom this opportunity would be a lost opportunity because there's no way that they could process the cases. But for those who are now in the process and those who will be in this process, for them we could make a magnificent difference. And this could be that moment of difference that we can harness. To start off with, then I would ask everybody to keep their mics muted. We will use the chat box. We have a facility wherein any questions will be forwarded to me, and I will put those questions to the speakers as they come forward. So please use the chat box today as much as you can in terms of comments, insights, questions. So let us then begin. And I would like to begin first of all with Shashi Tharoor, who many of you know. He has written many books that we have read that has been part of our knowledge and understanding of how the world works. But he's also currently a member of Parliament and a former Under Secretary of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And let me begin then by asking you, Shashi, sir, that in what we see as extraordinary times, because these are extraordinary times, we see an exponential increase in the number of wage theft. And I know that this is something that you have seen just in the media coverage that you have in India and in your own state kind of thing, of how this has been reported and carried kind of thing. So from your experience and from what you have been engaged in, what are the avenues needed and avenues that could be explored at the international level to draw attention to this issue that takes place, and what existing systems are there basically where we can take this up as a collective, and because the current systems seem to be inefficient and ineffective and many times in addressing this issue of wage theft, and with millions at stake both in terms of workers and in terms of resources, what avenues in your experience is something that we can explore? To you, sir.
Right. Thank you very much. You can drop the sir, William. Good to see you all. And I'm glad you've gathered together on this very important topic. In my case, it's not just what I've read in the newspapers. I'm actually dealing with many of these cases as a member of parliament because, of course, a lot of people amongst the Indian migrant workers in foreign countries who are affected by problems of wage theft will often turn to their MPs for assistance. And so I've actually had to deal with multiple cases of this nature. And during my brief stint as a minister in the External Affairs Ministry, I also had an opportunity to speak to ministers of labor as well as of external affairs in many of the Gulf countries about some of these issues. This is one of the issues that I had to raise with them. Now, very simply, with the two kinds of problems involving wage theft, one is, of course, those affecting our Indian workers abroad, and the cases I'm most familiar with are indeed in the Gulf countries, because precisely the volume, the number of cases is so very large. But there's also a significant problem within the internal migration situation in India that's worth briefly acknowledging as well. In all these cases, there are three kinds of problems. One is that people write to me saying, we haven't been given our salary for 3 months, we haven't been given our salary for 6 months, we haven't been given our salary since we got here. We just basically given food to survive and nobody pays us anything, even though we were promised all sorts of things when we took up a job. That's the delayed payment situation. The second is the reduced payment situation, where you say you're promised 800 dirhams a month when you leave Kerala and you get 600 dirhams or 500 dirhams in your paycheck when you actually get to the country you're working in the UAE. And the final thing is, of course, there's no payment, and those particularly happen, no payment at all, happens in situations of extremists. For example, war breaks out, civil war in Yemen, a civil war in Libya. A lot of our migrant workers suffered because, in fact, they didn't want to leave these war-torn places with bombs dropping all around them because they said that everything we work for will be lost if we can't collect our wages before we leave. And many risked their lives. Some lost their lives, and we had to really work hard to get some of these people to evacuate because they literally had no payment. So we've got all of these injustices. And in all these situations, where the situation is not a war or a complete breakdown, then what I tend to do as an MP is to work through the embassies. Most of our embassies in these countries where we have substantial migrant workers have officers called a community welfare officer or an analogous title, whose sole job really is to look after complaints relating to Indian community members in those countries and their problems they're having. And wage theft is very often a significant problem. I must admit they may be so burdened with the large volume of cases that they don't always give them the priority they deserve. And that's where an MP's intervention can often help. So when a complaint reaches me, I bring it to the attention of the ambassador, who pushes it down to the officer concerned, saying, pursue this, chase up the company, intimidate the company, and so on. And that often works. Of course, in many cases, workers are afraid to complain. Their passports have been impounded or confiscated by the employer, which is strictly speaking illegal, but it happens a lot. And very often the embassy has to step in and do something. But ultimately, the real problem we all have is that when people act in bad faith, when an employer really doesn't intend to pay and doesn't want to pay what he is contracted to pay or has promised to pay, there is very little by way of a mechanism of justice. The Indian embassy is not going to get involved in civil litigation in the courts of those countries. It is up to the worker. No worker can afford a court case. So unless a civil society organization like Migrant Forum in Asia is willing to step in and actually say, hey, we'll help, we'll file cases on your behalf or whatever, justice turns out to be very elusive. There is no overwhelming, overarching justice mechanism that anybody has established or been agreed to. And the problems, of course, are compounded by the whole lot of other problems. And if you look at the internal migrants in India, and we've all woken up to their situation when we faced the crisis at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, there may be 150 million internal migrants across our country. Many of them have minimal access to social security, negligible or no access to healthcare. There are no government schemes for them. There are no established grievance redressal mechanisms in the event of job disputes. And when they have non-payment of dues, where do they go? They can't again afford the court system. So it's a real problem that that migrant workers, whether internal or external, have no one to fight for them. I saw a 2018 study, which was reported on scroll.in, that said that wage theft in the construction industry alone is about 6,400 crore rupees per annum. And that's the kind of money we're talking about that is being denied to ordinary people for whom that money is what they're working for in order to survive. And I think it's absolutely criminal. It is unjust. And so the call for justice is indispensable. Now, with foreign workers, as I say, at least the embassy can make a preliminary intervention, and that sometimes works. But I think we need to go beyond that. We need mechanisms where, for example, governments in those countries should be pressed to engage provisions. One idea that I've had, for example, could be to actually ask the governments of the host countries, the receiving countries of Indian migrant workers, to require any employer seeking a visa for a migrant worker to place a certain deposit in escrow, which would cover, let's say, 6 months' wages of that employee, in order to ensure that if he defaults, instead of it being wage theft, the government would actually kick in and pay that deposit to the worker. Otherwise, the visa is not issued. I mean, this kind of policy might actually help if the governments of the host countries, who actually have more influence over their nationals and companies in their own countries, have more impact than, say, our embassy, which is, after all, a foreign embassy in another country. In terms of domestic labor, I think we need to strengthen both labor laws and migration laws. When I was in the External Affairs Committee as chairman, I fought very hard for 5 years, from the very first communication to the then foreign minister, the late foreign minister, Sushma Swaraj, I've been demanding a new immigration bill. And I was fobbed off with one excuse or the other. The immigration bill goes back to 1983. It's grossly inadequate in terms of recognizing the dimensions of immigration today and the problems we've actually experienced in the 40 years since that bill was drafted. And we really need an updated bill that will protect our workers, including from wage theft. But sadly, we don't have any progress on getting an immigration bill. And now that I have been moved off that committee by our wonderful government, and a BJP member now chairs that committee, it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, to insist that the government take the steps that they need to take. So these are some of the ideas: an immigration bill from India, action by the host governments for migrant workers, and then effective action by NGOs and civil society movements like yourself to give support, including, if necessary, legal assistance in order to either prevent wage theft or remedy it when it happens.
Thank you for that, and I hear you on this, the role that the embassies and the missions could play. And I'll just put a follow-up question with regard to that, because one of the things that we ourselves have noticed is that there is a power dynamic that does come into play between country of origin and country of destination. There is also a question of resources, there is a question of capacity, there is a question of limitations with regard to the embassies. And like you said, then sometimes we civil society organizations have to resort to MPs or other kind of leverage to get the embassy to move, kind of thing. So, but the question, and you rightly also pointed out that at the end of the day, it's a countries of destinations national justice system that needs to be improved. It's not that the embassies of foreign nations are going to improve that. So this kind of deficit of national justice systems in countries of destination to look into these issues of migrant workers, where which are not being addressed. How do we raise that issue? And you have, of course, talked about from the Indian perspective, but if we also know that governments are involved in bilateral agreements, in regional processes, is in international discourses like the Global Forum on Migration and Development, in the Global Compact on Migration. Shouldn't these spaces be used to be able to bring together some collective understanding and a collective kind of a rationale for moving forward the issues of migrant workers, particularly these kind of vulnerabilities? Can't these spaces be spaces for that, rather than put so much of a burden on the country of origin to fight for its people?
No, I agree with you, William. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, these are amongst the issues I raised in the External Affairs Committee in my last year when the Global Compact on Migration was being negotiated. And I asked our negotiators to come and testify before the committee as to what they were doing to protect our workers. Not enough is my short answer, but that's another matter. You know, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which in many ways is the institution that we should all look to for maintaining standards of labor around the world, they have predicted that about 195 million jobs are going to be wiped out during the pandemic. So this is a huge immediate crisis. What you and I have been talking about is a chronic problem that predates COVID and will probably last beyond COVID and which needs to be addressed. But it's getting desperately intense during the COVID pandemic. And we are finding case after case, I'm hearing about anecdotes in which employers and countries are offering migrant workers a straight choice between losing their jobs and working on slash salaries, signing reduced contracts, or actually just accepting verbal contracts, unwritten, unsigned, in which they settle for half the salary they're supposed to be paid. And you know, you've gone to a foreign country, you've often incurred a huge amount of expense, inconvenience, and difficulty to go. You're from a poor family, you have no job or other security waiting for you back in your home country. What do? You go along with whatever is imposed upon you. And what's happened is that COVID has become an excuse for all these people to do the worst things that we have seen before COVID, and they're doing it this way. There is simply no transnational mechanism to address these concerns. The Global Compact is a non-binding declaration of pious intent. It leaves workers susceptible to exploitation and salary theft. And don't forget that external migrants across borders, have all sorts of other added pressures. There's visa expiration issues. You have to get an entry visa when you go in with certain conditions. You need an exit visa before you can leave. Your passports are often impounded by your employers. If you stay late, there's overstay fines. If you give trouble, the employer may not give you back your passport or may not give you any wages. It's an incredibly difficult situation, and wage theft becomes widespread unless you're lucky enough to have a good faith employer, which obviously many do, but I'm just saying that many don't, and that's precisely the problem. So civil society organizations such as yours, such as the Migrant Forum on Asia, are crucial. I mean, obviously you guys have to operate along with unions, workers, collectives, and so on, to ensure that workers are able to access the benefits they're entitled to. I agree with you, we can't leave it all to our own government, and frankly, our own governments have not always been, as I've pointed out with the example of the immigration bill, our governments have not always been on the ball in standing up for immigrant workers' rights. They've got enough on their plates from their point of view. And I think that if we look at our domestic laws, they're very, very often inadequate. The labor code on wages that came out last year actually dilutes the responsibility of the principal employer for wage payment, and has replaced labor inspectors with facilitators. And we've got a situation where, I mean, if you take one example, the construction workers in our country need a welfare card to obtain income support. But when you had a survey being conducted among construction workers, who are all migrant workers, internal migrants in India, it turned out that only 1 in 5 workers had a card. Now, obviously, with external migrants, documentation is not a problem. But lack of communication is. A lack of language skills definitely becomes a problem. How many of our workers can even understand what their rights are and execute them or pursue them in a country where everything is done in the language they don't know? So these are all genuine problems. I'm sorry, I know you're looking for solutions in this conversation, but all I can say is we need to fight on.
So I will propose at least a partial solution of how we could, and as a member of parliament, and I see a former member of parliament also here, Mr. Kuntia, also, and I was wondering, and you have pointed out the role of missions. Part of the call is, because there are a lot of these kind of restricted flights, these repatriation flights, which are being organized by countries of origin. Part of the call is requiring that when workers register for this repatriation flight, that they should be given a chance to lodge any labor grievance that they have before taking on that flight unconditionally. And the embassy should then secure the power of attorney, so that even if the worker has left the country, the possibility of pursuing that case is still exists. And it would be great to see if this could be taken up in the Indian Parliament, and missions would start documenting this. We have already lost a lot of data in the sense of more than 500,000 to 600,000 workers have already come back in repatriation flights, but we know that this is going to go into the millions by December. So it would be really great to get some movement in Parliament on this.
That's a very, very good idea, William. I don't know if Parliament alone is a mechanism, but certainly as an individual MP from a constituency with a significant number of migrant workers, I can certainly write to the Foreign Minister as well, requesting this. And waiting for Parliament may not be a good idea, because these Vande Bharat flights are continuing right now, even as we speak. So I'll certainly take up the idea very much, very, very quickly. It's an excellent idea, and I don't think it should be that difficult to implement. I will suggest it. I will certainly suggest it. Thanks for that. That's a good one.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your time as well on this call. I know you.
Just one last thing, and I do have to leave because I have another function at 6. I just wanted to say that you had asked about whether any international mechanisms or transnational mechanisms are possible. I know very often people talk about the Iraq Compensation Commission at the UN, which paid compensation for people whose lives, wages, companies, etc., have been disrupted by the Iraq war. That is not a good model. That won't work. And the reason is very simply this. Number one, Iraq had sanctions upon it, and Iraq had to put all its oil money into an escrow account managed by the UN. So inevitably, the UN actually had money from which they could pay out this compensation. Whereas today, there is no, neither the United Nations nor the International Labour Organization nor the International Organization for Migration has any sequestered money from any government, let alone from any private employer, to compensate lost wages. So I do want to stress for wage theft, when you look for international solutions, they have to be more in the terms of laws, policies, regulations, and something that I suggested for foreign countries would be, as I said, fixed deposits to be paid by people seeking visas for immigrant workers, rather than some sort of overarching international or transnational compensation commission. That's not on offer. But I would call for greater support for the ILO's work. I think there should be more labor resolution mechanisms, including labor tribunals, for migrant workers under the ILO's umbrella. They're an organization that brings together employers as well as unions, as well as governments, and that's the only UN body that really does that. So we need to maximize what we can get out of that. I like very much your idea on registering labor grievances. Collection of evidence is also very important to ensure that labor laws are followed. And in the meantime, emergency relief programs. I mentioned legal aid so that our migrant workers are able to pursue justice. But also perhaps we all need to look for donors so that we can actually stand between an unpaid migrant worker who's suffered wage theft and absolute starvation. Very often there's no one there to turn to unless some mechanism is created that will address that. So those are some final ideas. Thank you so much for having me with you. And my apologies, I have to abandon the discussion at this point, but your questions have really got me off thinking in a constructive light, and you've given me an idea I will follow up immediately.
And thank you for your idea as well. So on this escrow fund, this has been a thought that has been circulating for some time now. And I think in the building countries do bilaterals and things like that with countries of destination, this might be an important issue to put both within global discussion, but also within bilateral discussions. So thank
Great.
you for that. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you very
sir,
much
for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you. And now we move on. And I come to Rola Hamati from the Center for Cross-Regional Network for Migrants and Refugees, and who has also co-launched this together with the other three organizations: Solidarity Center, Lawyers Beyond Borders, MFA,